Before we get started, I have time codes below that divide this review into different sections. The first portion of this video will be spoiler-free for Final Fantasy X, and the end of this video, the TLDR section, will also be spoiler-free. So if you just want to watch the beginning and ending of the video to see if you'd be interested in the games, feel free to check them out. However, it is going to be impossible to talk about Final Fantasy X-2 without spoiling Final Fantasy X. So there will be no spoiler-free coverage of X-2 outside of the TLDR. With that, we got a long video ahead of us, and I thought that Final Fantasy X and X-2 were such interesting games to experience, and I had a bunch of thoughts while playing through these games that I really wanted to make a video talking about them. With that spoiler warning and preamble out of the way, let's dive right into Final Fantasy X. The spoiler-free version of the story. Titus, and I'm gonna keep calling him Titus throughout the whole video, is an all-star blitzball player for the megatropolis city, Zanarkand. During the game honoring the 10th year anniversary of the disappearance of the greatest blitzball player and Titus's father, Jecht, a giant monster called Sin attacks the city. Titus and his mentor Auron fight back against Sin before they are eventually defeated. Titus wakes up in some sunken ruins where he meets Riku and her Al-Bhed scavengers. Riku tells Titus that Zanarkand was destroyed by Sin over 1,000 years ago, and their salvaging ship is then attacked by Sin, and Titus now washes up on Besaid Island. There he runs into Wakka, who recruits Titus to join his blitzball team, and Wakka also happens to be a guardian to Besaid's summoner, who is currently undergoing a trial of the faith. Titus and Wakka go into the temple after the summoner since she's been in there for over a day. It turns out the summoner is Yuna, and after she passes the trial, she and Titus hit it off. Yuna and her guardians are going on a pilgrimage to all the temples around the planet Spira, with the end result being to defeat Sin. Every 10 or so years, a grand summoner journeys to these temples to gain the ability to summon Aeons. After visiting all the temples and collecting all the Aeons, they then perform the final summoning, which defeats Sin, entering the world in an era of calm until Sin returns again. Yuna's next destination is the city of Luca, which is where a big blitzball tournament is being held, and Wakka decides to bring Titus along with the other guardians to the tournament to see if anyone would recognize him, and to use him as a star blitzball player. In Luca, that's where Titus meets up again with Auron, and it turns out that Yuna's father, Braska, was the last summoner to defeat Sin 10 years ago, and Braska's two guardians were Auron and a mysterious man named Jecht, who just so happened to be Titus's father. Auron and Titus become Yuna's guardians, and the group leaves Luca to continue the pilgrimage to the other temples and eventually defeat Sin. That's basically the setup for the game. Titus is a fish out of water, time-traveled into a ruined future where a giant monster is constantly wreaking havoc, and he joins Summoner Yuna and her squad of guardians, going around the world to earn the summons of the faith in order to perform the final summoning and defeat Sin and save Spira. What I like about this game's story is that it has a lot of good concepts going on in it that I think are really cool. The world and history of Spira and the web of lies and truths that build up its religion are really fascinating. After playing through Final Fantasy X, I read the wiki synopsis of the plot and was like, wow, this is such a cool story. I really wish that the game was less confusing about saying it, because the actual plot of Final Fantasy X is very cool, and I enjoyed it a lot. And when we get into spoilers, hopefully you'll see why. But the dialogue and delivery of the plot is just awful. Some stuff is just delivered in extremely convoluted ways, if not downright inferred, because it's never actually said. Tons of jargon and word soup being spilled by countless characters, and to be honest, this game can become a slog to get through when it comes to cutscenes, because the delivery of the story is so freaking bad. But I think the relationships between the characters and the big emotional journey they go on is a good one. Titus, Yuna, and Auron do a lot of carrying of the character interactions, as they're essentially kind of the main trio of characters. It's hard to aptly describe, but the actual words being said in FF10 and the delivery of those words are pretty bad. But the concepts and the history and the overall message behind it, what those words are describing, is pretty cool. And the journey itself is a fun one. As far as gameplay goes, Final Fantasy X is a Japanese role-playing game. I know, it's a big shock, but it's actually pretty different from the previous entries in the series. On a gameplay level, it is turn-based. And so in some other Final Fantasy games, mainly 4 through 9, they had a type of gameplay called the Active Time Battle System, or ATB for short. And the ATB would have a bar that fills up, and when it's full, that character can then attack. And the speed at which their action bar fills up is dependent on the speed stat of that character. In essence, faster characters get to take more turns, or faster actions got to happen quicker than slower actions. And I'm bringing up the ATB because Final Fantasy X doesn't have it. It's a more standard turn-based attacking structure. Though to be fair, different actions and attacks do change the speed in which a character gets to take their next turn. The only difference is that it is turn-based and not done in real time like the previous ATB games. And the combat of FF10 is very fun. Each character is essentially their own class. Yuna is a white mage, Riku is a thief, Lulu is a black mage, Auron is a knight, and so on. Each character fills their own role pretty well, and they have their own strengths and weaknesses, which makes tackling strong or complicated enemies engaging, since you have so many classes at your disposal. And that's worth bringing up, because swapping party members is nothing new, but in Final Fantasy X you can swap party members in the middle of combat with zero downsides. And also experience points are just given out to every party member who participates with no divisions. What I mean is, say you have just Titus kill a fiend all by himself, and he gets 1000 XP. If you have Titus plus 5 of your other party members kill the same fiend, each of them would all still get 1000 XP. So the game heavily encourages you to include all of your party members in every fight you can, instead of just relying on a small group of your favorites. Anyway, back to the combat, the enemies of FF10 also include a cool magic resistance system. It's like Pokemon. Fire beats grass, grass beats water, water beats fire. We all know Pokemon. In Final Fantasy X, fire beats ice, and ice beats fire, and water beats lightning, and lightning beats water. It's nothing complicated, it's nothing deep, and it's nothing new, but I like that they don't get any more complicated with the typing system beyond those 4 types. Even though there are other types of magic, none of them have a weakness chart or anything. And keeping the base magic system simple is good, because the other stuff can get pretty crazy. Yuna is not the only healer supporter in the gang, but she is the only character that can summon. In other Final Fantasies, summoning was a big move that dealt a lot of damage to the enemies and usually had some sort of flashy animation or something behind it. In this game, Yuna summons an Aeon, and you control it like you would any other party member. It's got some special moves, but mostly it acts as a powerful ally that can come in and do some serious damage to tougher enemies. And now, I don't know if it was just me, but outside of very specific boss fights and situations, I didn't really find the summons to be all that useful. It almost felt like their lengthy summon cutscenes and limited move pools were just not worth it, opposed to just continuously switching out other characters and playing the game like normal. Limit breaks also make a return in Final Fantasy X, and these things are powerful special moves that normal characters, as well as summons, can do that are super stylized and usually require some sort of special input to successfully pull off, with the reward being massively major damage. Each character has multiple unique limits, as well as ways of filling the limit meter. When you start off the game, the only way for a character to fill their limit meter is by having them take damage. Eventually though, you can unlock new ways such as dealing damage to enemies, healing allies, or having allies take damage for ways to fill up that meter. And it's cool because you can have your support characters fill up their limits in much better ways than just getting hit by a bad guy. Overall though, combat is pretty good, and it can get pretty crazy with spell and item combinations that make characters incredibly powerful. But just playing the game normally, I enjoyed the variety and the engagement of all the different enemies and the different ways to fight them and the different strategies you have to implement to beat certain opponents. One thing to bring up though is that certain characters really fall by the wayside, especially if you didn't build them properly. The most commonly unused character has to be Kimahri. He's a blue mage and dragoon of the party, but if you're like me and don't play a lot of Final Fantasy games, those words mean nothing. Kimahri just doesn't do enough physical damage or magic damage to warrant being used over other characters. And his shtick of using enemy moves just wasn't as useful as the special abilities other characters provided. Now for me, Wakka also fell off pretty hard. I had always heard that Wakka was the most powerful character in the game, and if my research has dug anything up, that's because of one of his limits, which are apparently really good. I'll explain how you get his really good limits later in the video because it will be relevant later, but I never got them personally. So Wakka ended up not doing anywhere close to the same amount of damage as Auron or Titus. And Yuna and Lulu both had good magic, and Riku and Yuna could both heal and do support. And Riku had access to a whole bunch of items that ended up being really useful. It's hard to know exactly how to build these characters to make them all useful and make them all viable, and it's extremely hard to know how to do that on a first playthrough. And speaking of that, leveling up in Final Fantasy X is fairly unique, I would say. Instead of leveling up and unlocking stats as you go up in levels, each new level unlocks one movement on the sphere grid. The sphere grid is the real make or break for players of this game. You unlock new stats, spells, and moves via spheres on the sphere grid. You can also unlock new spheres that allow for characters to learn moves learned by fellow party members. So Yuna could get Viagra, or Riku could learn Curaga without having to actually make their way to those spells on the sphere grid. The grid allows for some interesting character customization, and there is some creativity there. I talked about building characters a couple minutes ago, and yeah, with the sphere grid, because you pick and choose what spheres each character gets, you can technically build characters in different ways. The thing is, if you don't know how to build the characters, let's say it's your first playthrough, knowing what builds are good or even sensical is, in my opinion, asking a little too much from the player. Just look at how big and overwhelming this system is. I had actually taken some of my characters down the wrong routes. Like Titus is really good because he has early access to haste. But if you're like me and don't know that, you could lead Titus all the way in the other direction and build a pretty bad main character. And then I had to earn movement spheres to move Titus all the way back to the area I actually wanted him to go. After playing Final Fantasy X for around 40 hours, I now like the sphere grid. I think it's actually really cool, and now that I have ideas and know how to build things, I have a good direction of where I want to build characters in other playthroughs. And even in the HD remaster, you can play with expert sphere grids, which allow for even more customization between the party members. But it is just a massively overwhelming system, especially when you're not prepared for it. So because all your stats and abilities and whatnot are gained from the sphere grid, the weapons and armor of the game don't usually buff character stats, but instead give passive bonuses. There are the occasional increased strength by 5% or increased magic by 10% stats, but a majority of the abilities offer things like counterattacking, adding elemental damage, permanent scan, adding blind to attacks and stuff like that. And armor usually has elemental or debuff resistances with the occasionally advanced auto med or reduce spells to 1 MP type of abilities. You can also change your weapons while in combat, but I personally didn't use that option too much. And having an arsenal of weapons on hand to combat different situations, since you aren't swapping them out for stats, is pretty cool. It made having a lot of gear on hand feel useful, instead of in other RPGs where you generally replace the lower statted gear with new gear with higher numbers. Around a third of the way through the game, you get the ability to customize your gear too, using different items to add new bonuses to weapons and armor. And that's probably it for all the core gameplay elements of Final Fantasy X. There are just a few more things I want to talk about before we get into spoiler territory. The first are the mini-games. I mentioned that Titus and Wakka are blitzball players, and well, in the game you have to play a few blitzball games. And you can even voluntarily play more of that mini-game later if you want. I don't know why you would, but you can. Blitzball is just a frustrating mess of controls and rules and stats, and I had no fun with it at all. And Wakka's special limit I talked about earlier comes from playing Blitzball, and I just could not stomach playing that game mode any more than I had to. It wasn't fun, and is surprisingly frustrating for even the little amount of time you're actually required to play it. And to be honest, none of the minigames in FF10 were fun for me. The chocobo riding is awful, the lightning dodging minigame was also bad, the jack shot was lame. They all felt poorly implemented, lengthy in explanation, and just soulless in their execution. And don't get me started on this creature capturing mini quest. A little late into the game, you get this side quest that is basically just killing creatures with certain melee weapons. And to get anything substantial out of this quest, you gotta kill a lot. And I mean a lot of creatures. And it's boring and tedious and just downright disrespectful of my time. I put some work into some of these mini games, but honestly, I did not enjoy any of them to any real degree. The last thing I want to say about Final Fantasy X is that it's a very linear game. Once Titus starts his journey, it's going to be like 20 hours until you can comfortably backtrack. I would recommend using a guide for this game, if only because there are things you will probably miss and not realize it, and then you won't be able to get them later, or at least not in any reasonable manner. There also aren't a lot of side quests. A lot of this game is just it's one linear single quest. And that's fine. I actually don't mind that at all. It's just maybe nowadays where games are offering mini quests and side content left and right, it feels a little weird to go back and play a game that's mainly focused on its one big quest line. So now we've gotten into spoiler territory. Again, if you want to stay spoiler free, head over to the end of the video at the TLDR section and the time codes below or on the bar. Alright, let's just pick up the story where we left off. After leaving Luca and setting off on their pilgrimage proper, the gang runs into another summoner, Maester Seymour Guado. He's a big shot in the religion of Yevon and also leader of the Guado people. Seymour is pretty obviously going to be the bad guy, and after a few stops along the pilgrimage, Seymour invites the gang to his mansion, where he asks Yuna to marry him. Riku shows up after failing to kidnap Yuna, and she joins the party. It's revealed at some point in time that Riku is Yuna's cousin and that Yuna is half Al-Bhed. And to be honest, this never really becomes a factor. Wakka is the most religious of the gang, and he also has some issues with the Al-Bhed, but those issues never manifest in any real meaningful way. Anyways, the gang also ventures into the far plane at one point, and this is worth mentioning, because the far plane is essentially the afterlife. So spirits of the dead end up there if they are sent. So when a person in spirit dies, their spirit needs to be sent by a summoner. Otherwise, they linger and eventually become fiends, which are the monsters you fight around the world. Sent spirits end up in the far plane, and folks can try to visit and talk to the dead there. Titus noticeably cannot talk to Jecht. Arn eventually reveals to Titus that Sin is in fact Jecht. So it makes sense that Titus can't speak to his dad in the far plane since his dad is technically not dead. He's just a giant civilization-destroying monster. After encountering the spirit of Seymour's father in the far plane, Yuna agrees to marry the Maester. Titus and the gang find out that Seymour killed his father and took leadership of the Guado people, and they go off to stop Yuna from getting married. They confront Seymour, who's like, "Oh, you figured out my plan?" And I'm like, yeah, sure, what plan? But then the gang fights and kills Seymour, getting Yuna back, who had only agreed to marriage in the first place in an attempt to get close to Seymour to convince him to turn himself in for his crimes. Like I said, the big picture plot of FF10 is good. The big picture. Anyway, the Guado chase the gang away before Yuna has a chance to send the spirit of Seymour, and then they end up running into Sin. The gang all gets scattered, and most of them wind up in the Al-Bhed's home island, which, unfortunately, is under attack by the Guado. Riku's dad, Cid, is the leader of the Al-Bhed, and they reveal that they've been kidnapping summoners of Yevon in order to save them. Okay, so in order to stop Sin, a summoner has to go on a pilgrimage and collect all of the Aeons and then go to Xanarkand, where they perform the final summoning, which defeats Sin and starts the Era of Calm, however long that is, 10 or so years. Cid reveals to Titus that the final summoning always is a sacrifice. It will always kill the summoner, and Yuna has been marching to her doom this whole time. The Al Bhed don't follow the religious doctrine of Yevon, so they don't see a real reason to keep sacrificing summoners just to hold off Sin for a couple years, and then just repeat that for eternity. Riku and Titus vow to find a way to save Yuna from her fate, but first they gotta find her. She's been captured by the Guado and taken to the capital of Spira, where an unsent Maester Seymour is attempting to marry her. The gang hop on Cid's airship, fly off to the capital, where they fight off a few guards and manage to rescue Yuna from the clutches of Seymour Guado. The gang continue on their pilgrimage, and right as they get to the doorstep of the ruins of Zanarkand, Titus is granted a vision from the Faith. The Faith tell Titus that 1,000 years ago, there was a great war involving technology and machines, and that ended in total destruction, and also brought about the creation of Sin. The leader of Zanarkand, Yevon, had turned the people of the city into the spirits called the Faith, and had them manifest a dream version of Zanarkand. And that dream of Zanarkand would be hidden from the world, and would be kept safe forever, since no one would ever know where it was. No one would ever know about it, because Yevon had then used all of his power to generate a powerful spiritual armor around himself, and that is what turned into Sin. Sin is a monster with the primary goals of wiping out any human city that becomes too large or too advanced in technology, permanently preventing the world from Spira from ever having another war of machines, and his other goal is keeping the dreaming Zanarkand hidden away and undiscovered. That dream Zanarkand is where Titus is from. He is a dream, not a time traveler. And defeating Sin will end the Faith's dream, and so their Zanarkand and Titus will also end with it. At this point in the game, I like this a lot. Yuna has had to deal with facing her mortality and accepting that to defeat Sin, she has to give up her life. And Titus is also facing a very similar situation. The difference is the knowledge of all of it is reversed. While originally, everybody but Titus knew that Yuna was going to have to sacrifice herself in order to defeat Sin, nobody but Titus knows that he's a dream and that he'll have to sacrifice himself to defeat Sin, and more specifically, to defeat Yevon. The gang finally reach the ruins of Zanarkand and the opening credits of the game. They make their way to the heart of Zanarkand, where they meet the original summoner who performed the original final summoning, Lady Yunalesca. Yunalesca explains that to create the Aeon for the final summoning, one of Yuna's guardians or loved ones must be sacrificed to become the final Aeon. Like Yunalesca sacrificed her husband, and like how Summoner Braska sacrificed Jecht. This is when it all clicks. Jecht is Sin because he was the final Aeon, and after the final Aeon kills Sin, Yevon possesses that Aeon and slowly transforms it into becoming the next Sin. We're also shown scenes from the past where a young Auron is outraged to find this out, that both of his friends will die, just for the spiral of death to continue. After Braska dies during the summoning, and Jecht dies to become the Aeon, and then the Aeon gets possessed to become Sin, our young samurai returns to Yunalesca out of anger and revenge, and he's struck down by her. The Auron of our party is dead. He's an unsent. And his whole goal, the whole secret plot of this entire game, has been devised by Auron in order to get revenge on Yunalesca and to break the spiral of death. Yuna agrees with Auron that the final summoning will not accomplish anything, just postpone the inevitable for another 10 years. And she turns her back on traditions and the pilgrimage, and the gang fights and kills Lady Yunalesca, killing the only one who knew how to summon the final Aeon. The gang comes up with a plan to hymn Sin into a more docile state, one that will let them fly into the behemoth and fight Braska's final Aeon, making Yevon reveal himself. They will then kill Yevon, preventing him from creating another Sin, and thus breaking the cycle. And, well, that's exactly what happens. Titus has a moment where he confronts Jecht right before they fight, and it's cool to see that the beginning of the game shows the final boss arena, and even the music that plays in the opening FMV cutscene is Jecht's boss battle music. After killing his dad, Titus leads the party in a fight against Yevon, and after they deal with the former Zanarkand summoner, the world is saved. And the Aeons begin to fade away, and as the last of the Faith's dreams fade out, Auron has Yuna perform ascending on him. Then Titus and Yuna say they love each other, and Titus fades away as well. The game ends with the promise of an eternal calm and a world that is no longer trapped in an endless spiral of death. Now, I think this story is actually really sick. I love that the game leads you into thinking that Titus actually did time travel, only to pull a switcheroo on you and now he's actually a dream. I like that Titus dies in the end. Final Fantasy X does not cop out on the deaths. A lot of people die in FF10, and this game can get pretty dark. I'm happy that Titus and Auron both go. Auron is also such a cool character. He's easily my favorite character in the game, and I would have been a little bummed if they copped out on him not dying. Same thing with Titus. I actually, just to keep talking about Auron for a little bit, the machinations of Final Fantasy X are all set in motion by Auron. Auron rallies up the children of his 2 dead friends to go on a march to kill the devil and destroy religion, kind of with the idea to save humanity. But to me, Auron's mission always seemed like it was actually done much more out of revenge for the deaths of Braska and Jecht than it was for stopping the spiral. I also like Sin. The idea of a big giant monster that will just destroy you and everybody you know and love in an instant, and how it looms around the oceans of the world, that's badass. And its design is also really cool. It's not mechanical and it's not eldritch. It feels very Aeon-y, like sort of angelic, godlike monstrosity that's sort of been morphed into a terror. I like the design of Sin a lot. I like how he's much more of a force of nature than an actual villain. The real villain of the game is Maester Seymour, and he just continues to come back again and again and again and again and again. His plan is for him to become Sin, and then destroy the world and kill every living thing in it. And that will, technically break the cycle of death, arguably. And he's not very intimidating, not very rational, and to be honest, for me, not very interesting. He's like, what if Kefka was much more milquetoast? He's not the only major character I don't really care about. I don't really care for Titus either. And actually, wait, back up. 2 things about Titus. 1, because you can name him anything, it means that no one will actually ever say his name. And when other characters have names, and this one doesn't, it's super weird. I don't know if this is the last Final Fantasy game where you get to name your main character, but I hope it is. Because it is super off-putting to hear people be like, Wakka, Yuna, Auron, you guy, friend. It's weird. Anyway, and 2, Titus is really whiny. Jecht is constantly calling Titus a crybaby, and I kind of agree with him. He's just a real weenie. And, I mean, it's fine that he's not a brooding edgelord, but Titus kind of feels like Sora from Kingdom Hearts, but if he was more awkward and then complained in every single cutscene. Now some gameplay stuff I didn't want to talk about in the spoiler-free section, and that is mainly the linearity of the game. This game is pretty much a straight shot until you kill Lady Yunalesca and the Xanarkan ruins. Only after that do you unlock the ability to fight the final boss and also get access to the airship. Once you get the airship, you can fly to all the old areas of the game, do the few side quests that exist, and maybe go exploring for a bit. But what really gets me about the linearity are in the HD, Final Mix, or whatever editions, are the Dark Aeons. Dark Aeons lurk around the realm of Spira, and they are optional boss battles that are way harder than the final fights against Sin or Jecht. And this shit really got to me because I didn't start using a guide for Final Fantasy X until the Thunder Plains. And when I found out that I had to go back and get all the destruction spheres for the temples to get a special Aeon, I wasn't happy. And I was even less happy when I went back to the Besaid Temple to get that destruction sphere to find a boss that dealt party-wide 9999 damage to me on the first turn. Basically locked out of that side quest and Aeon until I was going to be too strong to need it anyways. Apart from the linearity, the voice acting is particularly bad. Also, the actual words in the script being said by the bad voice acting is also terrible. I do like the story, the big picture, the overall synopsis, all this cool stuff and themes and meanings. I like that. When I'm reading it on paper, I like the story of Final Fantasy X. I don't like how it was delivered to me in game though. I think Titus as a fish out of water, constantly pushing back against the religious ideas of Spira and Yevon, and him being a dream, I think all of that stuff is really good and I like it a lot. I also like that the game focuses a lot on Titus's relationship with Jecht. Jecht was able to be a kind and heroic man to everyone but his son, and how those two just have to accept each other and their flaws and still dislike each other at the end of the game, even though they both love each other too. I think that's good, and I think that created a pretty good story. I especially liked how near the beginning of the game we see a flashback where Kid Titus tells his mom he never wants to see Jecht again because he hates him. And then Titus's mom goes, well, if you never see him again, how can you ever tell him how much you hate him? Or something like that. And when Titus kills Jecht at the end of the game, Titus then says how much he hates Jecht. And I think the journeys of Titus and Yuna and Auron are all very good in their own way, and the story is incredibly solid. I also find the gameplay for Final Fantasy X to be pretty fun. Granted, you do have to build your team up through the sphere grid, but once you get that rolling, combat can be pretty engaging. Switching between characters and using their special skills and strengths is great. The music in the game is also good, and I really love this game's soundtrack. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy X. It got me pumped for the sequel. The story of Spira and the journey of Yuna doesn't end with Final Fantasy X, and I couldn't wait to dive right into what comes next. In certain editions of Final Fantasy X, including this HD version that I'm playing on Steam, came with a bonus 15-minute cutscene called The Eternal Calm. And this was Square Enix's way of testing the waters to see if people would play a sequel to 10. The cutscene takes place 2 years after the ending of Final Fantasy X, where Yuna is thinking about Titus. Waka and Lulu are a couple now, and they're expecting a child soon. Kamari is the leader of his people, and Riku has been out salvaging old Machina. The cutscene basically ends with Riku meeting up with Yuna to show her a video sphere, and that sphere shows a prisoner who looks an awful lot like Titus being held captive somewhere. Yuna then decides to go on an adventure with her cousin to find more clues that could lead her to this mysterious man. It is impossible to talk about Final Fantasy X-2 without spoiling major events of Final Fantasy X. And I think a lot of X-2's enjoyment comes from the fact that it is a sequel to 10. And I would highly recommend that you play 10 first before playing 10-2. But I don't know. I don't care. You're an adult. You can do whatever you want. Final Fantasy X-2 opens with Yuna performing a pop dance number at the Luca Blitzball Stadium where Riku and another girl named Pain are beating up a bunch of guards. Eventually, they confront the pop star summoner. It turns out that Yuna is an imposter, and Riku and Pain are allies of the real Yuna, who shows up later to help them take back her appearance. It turns out that Yuna's appearance was applied to a dress sphere that was taken by the LeBlanc Syndicate. And after stopping LeBlanc, the trio go back to their base, which is a remodeled airship from the last game, led by Riku's brother named Brother. The trio are a group of sphere hunters called the Gullwings. And you don't need to watch the Eternal Calm cutscene to know how Yuna gets from the end of 10 to the start of 10-2, because you're told pretty early on just what happened to everybody. And the religion that held Spira together for so long, the religion of Yevon, has proven to be pretty false. And new factions have risen up to replace it, causing a whole new set of issues. While all that stuff is happening, on a smaller scale, Riku had found a video sphere containing a video of a guy who shares an uncanny resemblance to Titus. So Yuna joins Riku in hunting down more spheres. Now Yuna is a fully fledged sphere hunter, and the Gullwings tech whiz Shinra has made the technology called a garment grid, which allows for the Gullwings to use the memories of a sphere to enhance their battle performances. And the dancer sphere that LeBlanc had used had a special connection with Yuna. And all that sets up for the rest of the game. Basically, the Gullwings travel around Spira doing missions and odd tasks trying to find or steal spheres that may or may not contain powers or memories. All the while, the new factions of the world, New Yevon, the Youth League, and the Machine faction all bicker and squabble with each other for power. The Gullwings discover that New Yevon, stationed in Bevel, have a giant machine monster called Vegnagun, which could destroy the whole planet. And a few spheres they have show the mysterious Titus-like man being involved with Vegnagun somehow. after which a bunch of dark aeons and fiends start pouring out of Spira's temples. The Gullwings then have to go around all the temples and defeat the dark aeons. So the Gullwings eventually meet up with the faction leaders when they all find out that the robot kaiju has gone missing, but it turns out that the Titus-like guy, who's called Shuyin, is actually a ghost from Xanarkand, the real Xanarkand from 1,000 years ago, and Shuyin has possessed the Youth League's leader, Nuge. But now he's transformed himself over to the new Yevon's leader, for some reason, and then runs off to the far plane. Shuyin is trying to avenge his dead girlfriend, Len, whose memories just so happen to be attached to the Dancer Dress Sphere, which is attached to Yuna, and so there's some connection between Yuna and Shuyin, but no matter what, the dude is determined to use Vegnagun to destroy the planet. So the Gullwings have to defeat him and destroy Vegnagun for good. After which, the world is saved, the ghost of Len comforts Shuyin, and they both fade away, and the faction leaders apologize to the people of Spira for being dickheads, and the game ends with the Gullwings heading out for their next adventure. Unless you get the good ending. So throughout the game, Yuna is constantly reminiscing about Titus, and she goes on her own little personal journey of having more of an active role in her life. And I like that a lot. Yuna was pretty much just following orders in the previous game. Here, she has a lot more agency, at the very least. In gameplay terms, though, there are certain parts of the game that Yuna can remember Titus or try to even whistle for him. And if you do all these little Titus-related moments, at the end of the credits, the Faith returned Titus back to Spira, as a real boy this time. The game really ends with Titus coming back to life, and him and Yuna being reunited on Besaid Island. The story is much more focused on the character growth of the Gullwings than it is on the plot, and to be honest, Yuna gets a lot of that focus, and then Pain gets a reasonable amount, and Riku has very little depth at the end of X-2 than what she had at the end of Final Fantasy X. But honestly, I think the story works so much better as an epilogue than as a sequel. It shows what happens to the survivors of 10. Wakka and Lulu have a baby, and how they're dealing with that. Kamari is leading the Ronso tribe, and the Ronsos are dealing with their anger towards the Guados, since Seymour Guado wiped out a lot of the Ronso tribe in Final Fantasy X. And how Spira itself is dealing with living a life without a giant monster roaming around the ocean. The fact that their religion was just a big lie, and how some of those folks are coping with that. I like that a lot. I think that's pretty interesting. I also think that since Final Fantasy X, you're inside Titus's head the whole game, and you get to see his side of his relationship with Yuna, I like that in X too, you get to see Yuna's side of the relationship. And so at the end, when the two reunite, it feels like you get the whole picture. Now, I don't think X-2's plot is anywhere near as interesting or as engaging as regular Final Fantasy X, not in a standalone sense anyway, but as a part 2, as like the aftermath, I like it a lot. The gameplay of Final Fantasy X-2 is, in my opinion, where it really shines. So if you remember, way back at the start of the video, I talked about the active time battle system. And that's because, while the ATB wasn't used in FF10, it does make its return here in X-2. Really though, the main difference is that these battles get a lot faster. Mechanically, they also added a combo system, so if the Gullwings attack the same target in a close enough time span, they deal more damage based on the combo number. And also moves like Reflect and Shell and stuff are all party-wide now and don't need to be applied individually. You can also do the same thing with cure moves as well as damaging spells. You can cast a move either solo or as a multi-targeted ability, but the multi-targeted form will always be less effective. Otherwise, same elemental chart, same debuff, same magic, no summons, but it's basically just running off the Final Fantasy X engine. The real big difference here are the dress spheres. They act like little class capsules, and you can swap between them on the fly. The thing is that you have to level up the abilities of each dress sphere individually for each character. Let's say you max out Warrior on Pain, well, to get those abilities, you still gotta max out Warrior on Yuna and Riku if you want Yuna and Riku to have them. How the system works is you equip a character with a garment grid, and the garment grid has a number of connective slots. you socket those slots with dress spheres, and each character can have different garment grids equipped so they can have access to different dress spheres in combat. Being able to switch between classes is cool, and it makes up for there being only 3 playable characters, since there are a lot of playable classes. I like that you get to pick which abilities from each class you unlock first. The dress spheres overall offer a lot of freedom, and that freedom of progression can make going through the game feel pretty unique. For instance, in my game, Yuna wasn't the healer. Riku was my white mage. Yuna was like a gun mage or a blue mage. In Final Fantasy X, Yuna was the white mage. Even if you had other characters take on her role, it was her role they were taking over. In X-2, the characters are a lot more flexible. However, I do think this flexibility is only surface level. So you have to unlock abilities and spells individually. But you also need those dress spheres too. Like once Riku started learning healing spells, that was it. There wasn't a real incentive reason to have another Gullwing become a white mage because I already had one. And to be honest, some of these classes feel a lot weaker than others. Yuna's main class, Gunner, I kept trying to run it because I wanted to max out each of the Gullwing's iconic classes respectfully, but I just always thought Gunner seemed pretty weak. Switching Yuna to a black mage or a gun mage or even having 2 warriors in the party seemed way stronger than having a gunner, or even really having a thief. And getting all these different and cool looking dress spheres later in the game, well, it's a tough sell to have Pain switch from her maxed out class to go samurai or something, which has way less abilities and might even deal less damage. Those classes would have to be super good, and even outright replace the old ones, like the Dark Knight. But I mean, some classes also just fall off. My Black Mage never learned level 3 magic because I never needed to learn it, and the other classes were just faster and did more effective damage. So there is a lot of freedom in 10-2, but on a casual playthrough, there are classes that are just dropped pretty quickly if they're even ever useful enough to begin with. Now, there is an argument to be made that you can switch between classes while in combat, and while that is technically true, and there are even bonuses you get from garment grids that encourage doing so, however, switching between classes does take a turn, and then you gotta go through a cutscene, which, for me, it kinda just became a lot faster and easier to only switch classes in combat when I absolutely needed to do that. Otherwise, switching mid-combat was never necessary and actually just took up more time than it saved. Switching classes mid-combat in 10-2 never felt as clean or smooth as switching party members in Final Fantasy X felt. The combat overall feels much more fast-paced, and the different classes are cool. I do like them, but I just wish that some of them felt more powerful or at least more useful to use for more of the game. So in Final Fantasy X, you follow Titus around as he follows Yuna around all of Spira, in essentially a straight line. Only at the end of the game are you given the airship to fly to any of those previous locations. In 10-2, you start already on the airship with all of those areas already unlocked. And that's a big reason why this game doesn't feel standalone, why it kind of feels like an epilogue. You can just go to the Xanarkan ruins right from the get-go, or go anywhere you want, in fact. All of the areas in 10-2 are ones already visited in Final Fantasy X. There might be some changes to them, but they're mostly similar, if not completely reused. I actually like that about 10-2, though. Making your way through these familiar areas is pretty cool, and it's cool seeing how the areas are different. Like the Mihen High Road is so different from before, or the Calmlands, or even how the Xanarkan ruins are now a tourist attraction. The game is broken up into 5 chapters, and you can visit all of these areas in around 4 of those 5 chapters. And each area usually has its own minigame or side quest that you can do, and then the next chapter will continue the plot of that area, if you did the mission previously, that is. See, that's kind of the thing about 10-2. It doesn't have that much direct story or plot, but that's because most of the game is dedicated towards its side quests. Going through and visiting every area each chapter is optional, but it's also kind of the point of the game. Plenty of missions are just mini games or even just cutscenes, and while they can get a little tiresome, it feels like it's all optional content that could have been in the first game. Not to mention that most of the minigames are way better than the minigames from Final Fantasy X. And thank God there's no more Blitzball. Wait, no.
I've always wanted to play Blitzball.
Why do we have to play?
It is weird and almost disappointing how little there is to do in FF10 after beating Unalesca. Not saying there was nothing to do, but the game did feel pretty bare outside of the main journey. And I don't even mind that decision that much, but playing Final Fantasy X-2 afterwards feels like this game is where all that side content ended up. It's just a big pile of side quests and minigames, and I don't mind that decision either. I will say that some of these quests are just a little too tedious, if not completely boring. And don't get me started on that math coin game. I am a dumb, stupid idiot when it comes to math, and I was sweating bullets in that final game against Shinra. Also, traversing the world is a little different. You're not really encouraged to go exploring that much since you can just fly anywhere whenever you want. And usually there's only one quest per area per chapter, if there even is a quest available. There's also a jump button, or like a context-sensitive button. Yuna can jump over certain areas or climb certain ledges depending on the situation. And this isn't the worst idea, but when it doesn't work, it can get pretty frustrating. The reuse of areas and the reuse of enemies work really well in this game. In my head, I kept comparing it to Majora's Mask, and I honestly think that I like X-2 better as an asset reuse than Majora's. Just seeing the same world and characters, but slightly different. And seeing the same enemies, but in a different battle system. Even seeing some of the same weapons. I actually think it's so cool Yuna uses Tidus's sword Brotherhood while she's in warrior form, and when she busts out his celestial weapon when she's a Dark Knight. I was pogging. I got a few other notes to go through that if I was a better YouTuber, I would have bothered weaving into the script more naturally. The FMVs that played at the end of the game and at the end of Chapter 4 showed me no visuals other than subtitles and a green screen, so I had to watch them all on YouTube. I still think it's weird that they never say Tidus's name, even in X-2. I know that they committed to that uncanny idea in the first game, but it's weird to hear them refer to their friend as you-know-who and that guy. Honestly, the game would have been narratively stronger if Yuna ever said the name of the guy she is in love with out loud. Oh yeah, the voice acting is much better in X-2 than it is in X. It still sometimes slips back into bad territory, but it is unquestionably a better audio experience during the second Spira adventure than during the first. Also, while the first game had Seymour, Jecht, and Sin, and a lot of good world building and antagonists, X-2's villains are very lackluster. I was never on board with the idea of Vegnagun. Something about having a giant robot just bothers me. I mean, if the people of Spira had a weapon this powerful all this time, how come they never tried to use it against Sin? But whatever, unlike Sin, who is constantly popping up throughout Final Fantasy X, we never really get to see Vegnagun until the end of X-2. And Shuyan is just not that interesting. He also has much less impact than the other characters. He has way less build-up than Jecht and way less interaction with the main cast than Seymour did. I also don't find any of the faction leaders to be particularly fun or interesting. Everyone who isn't a Gullwing feels pretty lackluster, to be honest. But I liked the Gullwings, including Brother, Shinra, and Buddy. They're pretty fun in their own way. And while I don't think Riku got a lot of character depth, she is still fun to have around, and her personality is pretty well defined. All three of the girls are very likable and enjoyable on screen. And Brother is definitely a goofy character who I enjoyed more than I thought I would. And I do love that Shinra is just a kid, so when they start applying all this pressure to him, he just runs away. There's a lot to like in Final Fantasy X too, and I found myself enjoying a lot of what the game had to offer. I do wish there was more to do, like more of the main quests to do. It definitely feels like a short story, especially if you only think about the story missions, but it's completely solid as a game and an excellent continuation of where Final Fantasy X left off. So if you're here to skip the spoilers, don't worry, I gotcha, hitting y'all with the spoiler-free TLDR conclusion. I really liked Final Fantasy X and X-2. I do think you won't get a lot out of X-2 unless you play Final Fantasy X first, but I think it's a great sequel to a great game. FF10 tells an engaging story with a lot of cool concepts, and it doesn't shrink away from serious consequences either. In fact, all of 10-2 is about dealing with the aftermath of 10. I enjoyed the stories of both games, though I definitely enjoyed the characters of 10-2 more than the characters of 10, except for Auron. But I do think the antagonists of Final Fantasy X are way better than the antagonists of 10-2. Gameplay-wise, the combat in both games are pretty fun. While 10-2 technically gives you more diversity in how to play the game, I enjoy the character swapping and character building of Final Fantasy X more than the class swapping of 10-2. Even though some characters are useless, I still kind of prefer it. I think both are cool though. The combat in both games are good. Both also end up having some pretty cool and complex boss fights that I enjoyed a lot. Visually, the art style of these games are solid. The actual art design feels pretty distinct and unique, though the animations remind me too much of 2002 Kingdom Hearts. I will say that Titus looks dumb as bricks, but Auron looks pretty sweet, so they balance each other out. Musically, I think these games have banger soundtracks, or, well, not banger, but like lo-fi soundtracks, you know what I mean? Anyway, a lot of the music in these games are really good. They really set the mood and atmosphere. I just wouldn't call them, bangers. And while Final Fantasy X feels pretty linear, 10-2 makes up for it by mostly being side quest focused. And that just might be it. Yeah, I think it is. I played through these games casually. I didn't 100% either of them, and I don't think it's necessary to do that either. I enjoyed my time in Spira, and after 80 hours of Final Fantasy X and 10-2, I think I'm good to leave it behind. At least for now. One day I might come back and play those games again. I mean, they are fun, and I enjoyed them. And if you haven't tried them out for yourself, I'd highly recommend giving them a shot. Okay, that's gonna do it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a good one. Take it easy.